Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bebbington.
We're going to continue our series today, Jan, about the Lake District farmers, but we've not got the Lake District farmers here with us today. Instead, we've got two soil experts.
And so I'd really like to welcome Professor Jess Davies and Professor John Quinton, who are partners in the Knowledge Transfer Partnership with the Lake District farmers and who are soil specialists.
Yes, Jess and John are both from the Lancaster Environment Centre, where we previously had on Alona Armstrong.
Yes,
so,
indeed.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I suppose I'd like to start off by finding out a little bit about yourselves. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and where soil comes into your work, Jess?
So, as Jan said, I'm a professor in Lancaster Environment Centre, and I'm interested in soil sustainability, how we can manage soils so that they can continue to function and do all the important things that they do for us, provide us with food, store carbon, help us regulate water flows. I'm really interested in soil sustainability, and I develop computer models that help us predict how soils change over time.
And how about you, John? How does soil fit in with your research and expertise?
So I'm a professor of soil science. So I actually trained as a soil scientist a long while ago now. So I spent probably 35 years working on soils. Focus of my work has largely been around the degradation of soils and then how we restore them. So trying to understand how we rebuild soils and some of those functions that Jess has just mentioned, the ability to support the production of food, store carbon, store water, and so on.
How does the work that you both do differ from each other, John?
So I would describe myself, I guess I spend quite a bit of time out in the field looking at soils, working with soils, doing experiments, measuring stuff in the field. I do a little bit of modelling work, but I would usually collaborate with Jess, who has a lot more expertise in that area than I do.
So John is accusing me there of spending most of my time at a desk in my research, and he's not wrong. So I spend a lot of my time developing computer models and working with great field and lab scientists like John who go out and set up experiments and measure the real thing. Sometimes they make me come out, usually in bad weather, to be honest. But they collect that great data, and I use the data, and together we're trying to work out to understand how soils work. They're really complex, really interesting systems and critical to life on Earth.
Does it help collaborating with your different areas of expertise? Does it improve the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's things that we can do together that just wouldn't be possible if it was just one or other of us working, and we can work at a much higher level as a team than we could individually. Anyway, that's my opinion. Just may have a different take on it.
Totally. I couldn't work without people that collect that great data and do great experiments. And it's great that John has an understanding and lots of experience with modelling as well, so we understand each other. But also we have slightly different focuses in where our expertise lies in terms of the soil science itself, not just the methods. John is a great world-leading expert on soil erosion and degradation processes in particular, whereas my focus is more on biogeochemical cycling, so the cycling of carbon and nutrients. So we have complementary interests in different aspects of soil as well.
Can I just say, before your question, Jan, I'm really glad that Jack explained what biogeochemical cycling meant, because otherwise I was just going to sit here scratching my head.
Sorry, it just came out.
It's fine, you explained yourself, which is all I ever asked.
Yes. I think what's really interesting then, and you've already sort of alluded to it in your answers already about soil being related to food, to water, to carbon cycles. And so our listeners will know that soil matters, but beyond that, they might not know too much more about it. So I was wondering if you can tell us what soil is and how different soils can be from each other.
Wow. Okay, so what is soil? That's a good kind of exam question, isn't it, for the students? So soil is a mix of organic and mineral material. It comprises air and water as well. And I think the key thing is that it's alive. Okay, so 57% of all the biodiversity on the planet is in the soil. So that's a huge proportion. It's often described as the living skin of the earth. It's not just some kind of inert material. We were laughing about sand dredging earlier. You might think of sand on a beach as a bit inert. Soil isn't inert. It's got life within it that's helping to do that processing of nutrients, the biogeochemical cycling that Jess was just referring to. And without that life, that doesn't happen. In terms of variety, I wouldn't say there's an infinite variety of soils, but there is a wide range of different soils with different properties. And we often think, if you think about your garden, you say it's a bit sticky or it's a bit of a clay soil. And then maybe if you live somewhere where you've got a bit more of a sandy soil, so that, that's a kind of a basic classification based on the size of particles. But there is also loads of other soil properties which dictate what soil type you have. And, if you go globally, that may run into hundreds of different soils. So just like, different species of plants and animals, you'll find a whole range of different soils across the globe.
And for the Lake District, where the knowledge transfer partnership's taking place, it might be, I don't know, this is an open question. It might not be hundreds of types of soil. Do they have a particular type of soil in those farm systems where the knowledge transfer partnership is focusing on?
They will have different soils within each of those farms,
wow.
But it will be from a more limited palette than the hundreds we've just described. So we're probably thinking in the order of 1 to 5 different soils within each of those farms, I would think.
So is that each farm has 1 to 5 different types? And then
yeah.
Are those 5 different types different on each farm?
Could be. So some of them will be the same, but some of them will be different. So you can imagine that if you're in an upland environment like in the Lake District, you've got quite a lot of elevation difference. So it's much cooler up there, wetter perhaps at the top of the mountain than it is at the bottom of the mountain. So you might start to see more organic matter accumulating at the top of those hills and in the wet spots. And then perhaps on the slopes you might have thinner soils, and at the valley bottoms you might have thicker ones again. So it's a big range of soil properties that we might encounter.
So with that, I'd like to ask Jess, then, what is the connection between soils and carbon? Because I think one of the revelations that maybe our listeners had, and I certainly had, is when, it's alive, as I've written that on my sheet of paper, it's alive, sort of not quite slightly scary, but not too scary. So is that carbon element the live element of it, or is it a mix of, again, chemicals as well as biological material?
So the carbon in soils is both organic and inorganic. The organic carbon is made up of living and decaying organisms. Soils are so important in terms of particularly organic carbon because they are the biggest store of organic carbon in the Earth system. So the amount of organic carbon that we have in soils worldwide is more than all the atmosphere, all the trees, all the plants, all the animals combined. So it's the biggest store of organic carbon in the Earth system. And that store, it can change over time. And there's a risk that we lose that carbon to the atmosphere and accelerate climate change, or there's an opportunity that we can increase the amount of organic carbon stored in those soils and help to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and help tackle climate change.
Do certain types of soil across all the types that John has spoken there do better for containing carbon, contain more carbon, organic or inorganic?
Yeah, definitely. So the content of carbon across soils varies to a great degree. John was talking about soil classifications, and the amount of organic matter that's in the soil will be determining some of that classification. To me, as a modeller, the way I think about it is that those soils are in constant evolution, and each one of them in each location has evolved along with the landscape, its climate, all the local things that happened in that particular locality over time, and how humans have managed it as well. We have a big influence on soils and the amount of carbon stored in landscapes. And so the amount of carbon can be very different across the landscape.
And will human activity over the past however many centuries have changed how soil is composed? Will it have changed the types of soil that there are?
Yeah, it can do. Because if you can imagine, if you clear a woodland, you might expose the soil surface, and you might have soil being washed off by soil erosion, and that soil being deposited at the base of the slope. And so you then creating almost a new soil at the bottom of the slope based on the material that's been washed off the slopes. The classic cases of this are in ancient Greece, which are described by Pliny the Elder, where water was washed off the hillsides and into the valley bottoms. And you can still see that if you visit those valleys today. Very deep soils at the base of the hills, but very little on the hill slope sides now. So our activities have influenced soil formation in the landscape.
I never imagined that during today's episode, Jan, we were going to be discussing Pliny the Elder.
Well, given you're a bit of a history buff, that must be a great bonus to you.
Yeah, we've discussed some things that have been off on total tangents in the past, but Pliny the Elder is actually not a tangent. It's totally relevant. That's even better.
Thank you, John, for encouraging Paul in these matters.
I'll keep quiet in the future.
No, please don't. The more ancient Greek, Roman history that we can somehow squeeze into this podcast, the better. I asked this question when we had a previous episode on sand, and I know we've discussed that sand and soil, we don't want to get into, is one a part of the other. But the question I asked on the sand episode was, is sand a finite resource or does it get created? And the answer was, well, it's just like fossil fuels. If you wait around tens of thousands of years, then more might be generated. What about soil? How was soil generated in the first place? And can it be regenerated or generated artificially?
Soil forms really slowly. So that's the first point. So we've actually done measurements using isotopic techniques, and we've calculated formation rates at 0.04 millimeters per year. So that's a tiny bit of soil. That's from weathering. So that's from sort of dissolution of minerals at the bedrock surface. If you compare that to the loss of soil by erosion, particularly in arable agricultural systems, it's orders of magnitude lower. So you're losing much more soil than you're gaining. And so this is one of those crises that we could face, perhaps not in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of our grandchildren or generations to come. In terms of rebuilding soils, there's a lot of interest in this at the moment, particularly in the restoration agriculture movement. And so you can build soils a bit from the surface as well. So by adding lots of organic materials, you can start to build the organic matter, but you won't replace that mineral material that's been lost. So you're much better off protecting what you've got than you are trying to rebuild once you've lost it. It's possible to rebuild some of those soil properties, but not all of them.
Why is soil science involved in the Lake District Farmers project?
So I think the interesting thing, why are soils involved in the Lake District Farmers project? I think they play an important role in the carbon budget of farms. As Jess has said, more carbon is stored in soils than is stored in the atmosphere and all the vegetation. So if we want to understand where the carbon flows are on a farm, we have to understand what is in the soil, and then we have to understand where it's going. And that's where Jess's modelling component is going to come into the project, because soil carbon changes quite slowly. So even if our farmers adopt very restorative practices, they're going to add lots more carbon, they're going to get vegetation cover on the soil surface all year round, that carbon stock is going to be a slow growth. And so that's why we need Jess to come in with a modelling component and help us project what's going to happen in the future.
I think there's been a huge surge in interest as well in soil carbon as part of carbon accounting and understanding whether there are losses in supply chains in the soils that underpin the supply chain, or whether there's perhaps opportunities for carbon offsetting within the very foundation, the soil that's supplying that supply chain. And so Lake District Farmers, a really interesting company that have engaged with this increasing interest in soil carbon, as well as their farmers, who some of whom are really interested in the regenerative farming movement that's looking to regenerate soils in order to support the sustainability of farming. So yeah, we're really excited to work with Lake District Farmers and to look throughout the farms that are part of their supply chain and look for the opportunities where we can store more carbon, and just to understand where there's carbon accumulated within those farms and where we need to look after it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think knowing where to protect it and where perhaps opportunities come to store more are going to be, important for these farmers as well as for Lake District farmers, the wholesaler.
What's really special about the work that you're doing in the project, particularly Jess, is that chance to sort of look into a crystal ball and use science and evidence to really know, if I stick to this course of action, where might it lead to? And particularly because the course of action that we're maybe asking the land managers to do will take some time. So they have to have the knowledge and the faith and the ability to think, right, okay, I need to stick with this because it will have this effect in the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. Soils change slowly, as John mentioned. And so, I might be biased, but I think prediction tools that help us predict how soils are changing over time are a really important part of the mix. It may take 10 years, 20 years before we can robustly measure a significant difference in these soils. But, it's still important to undertake those practices, and over a longer term, that can play an important role in mitigating climate change.
And I think it's especially important on these generational farms where they can invest for 20 years and they're interested in investing for 20 years, because for some of our farming colleagues, they've had several hundred years before them as well and hope to have more years beyond them. So I think that long-term view is really important for sustainability.
Are there particular types of activities on farms that can increase soil carbon and other activities that might deplete it?
So I think from my perspective, we think about the carbon cycle and we think about the carbon cycle on a farm. We've got to get more carbon into the soil. So that's got to come from somewhere. So you either got to have plants which are photosynthesizing, trapping carbon from the atmosphere and then incorporating it into the soil. So that could be cover crops, for example, which could be grown during periods where you don't have a crop on the soil. It could be recycling manures back into the soil that come from animals, so that you're using the manures that have been, sourced from the soil by the animals eating the grass and then returning that back to the soil.
Other practices might be relating to tillage. So tillage can increase the amount of air that gets into the soil and into the soil surfaces, and that can increase the activity of the microbes within the subsurface, and that then speeds up the amount of carbon that's being released from the soil, so you can get some release of carbon that way. But also tillage, it moves soil around, so it can be a cause of losing soils via soil erosion on site.
Is there any way of you being able to tell the effects that, as Jan says, some of these farmers up in the Lakeland have had farms there for hundreds of years maybe? Is there any way to be able to tell what the soil might have been like on this land compared to what it is as a result of the farms being there? Because even what might look like just a normal hill up in the Lake District tends to have sheep grazing on it most of the time, so it's been farmed to some degree or other.
So this is the type of thing that models can help us with. So in previous projects, we've simulated, for example, the whole of the UK and how soil carbon has changed over time for all of that period. And we can play games and experiments with models, and we can say, let's not have that land use change. So instead of converting those hilltops into grasslands, we can leave them as trees forever. And that gives us a comparison that, the original baseline for what that system could have looked like if we didn't do land use change. And the same for the other range of practices. We can switch them on and off in models, and that can help us understand what the relative contribution of those different drivers is to the current state of carbon in our soils. I guess, John, as working in the field and with experiments as well, there are other ways that we can try and look at that as well.
I think it can be quite difficult because soils vary across a landscape. So, I think if we were trying to do the same thing from a kind of a fieldwork perspective, I would be looking for parts of the landscape which in the Lake District context haven't been grazed. So finding those patches of ancient woodland that still remain and sampling in them. But the problem then it comes is how representative are those patches of the entire landscape, because very often they're in steep gills where the sheep don't like to get into. So I think that's from a kind of an empirical scientist point of view, that can be quite a challenging thing to try and do.
It's challenging in many ways to imagine the Lake District without being shaped by man, because whilst we all look at it as a national park and World Heritage Site, so much of it has been shaped by human activity. It's like there would be trees in so many other places if we weren't there. And yet you think of the Lake District, you think of the fells, and you think of the scree slopes, and you think of the bare grass, and you walk through all the way up to the top. It's not at all what you'd imagine it to be like if there hadn't been human activity there.
And of course that speaks to shifting baselines as well. So once climate change comes through the system, that whole baseline moves again, which is again why really good quality science and the modelling of it becomes really important.
I think that's a good point to draw this conversation to a close, Jan. I don't know about you.
So we hope that you, our dear listeners, who are mainly interested in sustainability and business, now know something a bit more about soils and why it's really important. That living skin on the planet that really, really matters. So next time that you're pottering around in your garden having a bit of a dig, I think you really need to listen and remember what you heard from Jess and John, because hopefully that makes your soil much more interesting to you.
Thank you very much, Jess and John.
Thanks for having us.
Next time, Jan, we'll be back with the Lake District Farmers. We'll be speaking to Phil Scott, and we'll be discussing issues around sustainability that he's come across with the LDF. Until then, if you do have any questions, please email us, pentlandcentre@lancaster.ac.uk. We'll see you next time. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bebbington.